January 17, 2020, Grantsville, Utah. Just after 7 p.m., an emergency call came in, not from the house itself, but from a woman driving fast toward the hospital. In her car were two people from the same family, a father badly injured and his teenage son. The caller told dispatch that there had been a violent struggle inside a home on Eastmore Drive, and she has two injured people in her car heading for the hospital. When police received the call, they rushed to the hospital. Officers met the car as it pulled in. The father was rushed inside for treatment, suffering from a gunshot wound and severe head injuries. He had been fighting for his life for nearly an hour. His son was still with him, calm, present, uninjured, but quite. As officers began separating people and asking questions, another detail emerged, one that shifted the entire focus of the response. 4 other family members were still inside the home. That's when police realized they weren't dealing with a single victim or a contained incident. Whatever had happened wasn't over yet, at least not in terms of what they were about to discover. When they arrived at the home on Eastmore Drive, they found a scene that would take years to fully process. 4 family members were already gone. A 5th, the father, was still alive, badly injured, clinging to consciousness after fighting for his life for nearly an hour. What made the situation even harder to understand wasn't just the scale of what had happened. It was who had done it. This wasn't a break-in. This wasn't a robbery. There was no forced entry. The person responsible had been inside the house the entire time. For a town like Grantsville, that detail alone felt impossible. This was a community where people raised families because it felt safe, where neighbors waved, where doors were left unlocked, where serious violence hadn't touched the town in decades. And yet, within the walls of that home, something had unfolded slowly, not in a single burst of chaos, but over hours, quietly, deliberately, one family member at a time. As police secured the scene, the reality began to settle in. This wasn't a moment of sudden rage. This wasn't an accident. The timeline told a different story, one that suggested planning, waiting, and decisions made in between. Outside, word spread fast. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the street, standing in small clusters, wrapped in jackets against the cold. And then came the detail that stunned even seasoned investigators. The suspect wasn't missing. He hadn't fled. He was already accounted for. He was 16 years old, a teenager, a son, a brother. By the end of the night, Grantsville would learn that one of its own families had been nearly erased, not by an outsider, but from within, and that the warning signs, whatever they were, had gone unnoticed until it was far too late. This is not a story about a monster hiding in the shadows. It's a story about a family that looked normal from the outside, a home that appeared stable, and a tragedy that unfolded quietly, behind closed doors, in a place no one expected danger to exist. Before we talk about what happened inside that house, we need to understand who the Haynies were, and how a family that seemed so tightly bound could come apart in the most devastating way imaginable. Before January 17th, the Haynie home was not a place people whispered about. It was a place people recognized. The house sat on a quiet street in Grantsville, the kind where kids rode bikes after school and parents waved from driveways. Nothing about it stood out, and that was exactly the point. It blended in, just like the family inside it. Colin Haynie was the kind of father people described as steady. He worked hard, believed in structure, and took pride in providing for his family. He believed that discipline mattered, that routine, faith, and responsibility were how you kept a household together. His wife, Alexia, was the emotional center of the home. Friends and neighbors remembered her as warm, involved, and deeply invested in her children's lives. She cooked constantly, gardened year-round, and poured herself into the daily rhythm of family life. The house was rarely quiet when she was around. There was always something happening, food being prepared, kids talking, plans being made. The Haynies had several children, and each of them had their own rhythm within the family. Alexis, the oldest daughter, was creative and focused. She played soccer, worked hard in school, and had a natural pull toward art and music. Teachers remembered her as thoughtful, the kind of student who paid attention, who tried. Matthew was known for his curiosity. He liked games that made him think, strategy, competition, problem-solving. He could be intense when he cared about something, but he was also the kind of kid who looked out for others without being asked. Milan, the youngest, was small but determined. She threw herself into whatever she was doing, sports, school, family activities, with more effort than anyone expected from someone her age. People remembered her energy more than her words. From the outside, the siblings seemed close. They spent a lot of time together. Much of their early education happened at home, which created a bond that neighbors often described as unusually tight-knit. There was also an older son, Danny, who had already begun building a life outside the house. He was in college, living independently, but still closely connected to his family. Phone calls, visits, regular check-ins, the kind of connection that made distance feel temporary. And then there was CJ. 16 years old, quiet, reserved. People who knew him didn't describe him as angry. They described him as withdrawn. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't draw attention. He was the kind of teenager who faded into the background of a room rather than stepping into the center of it. For most of his life, CJ had been educated at home, surrounded by siblings who understood him and a routine that felt familiar. But that began to change as he got older. Expectations shifted. The world around him grew louder, faster, more demanding. From the outside, none of this looked alarming. Families change. Kids struggle. Teenagers pull inward. These were things everyone recognized, things that didn't raise alarms on their own. If you asked the neighbors back then, they would have told you the same thing. The Haynies weren't perfect, but they were normal. A family that ate meals together, argued sometimes, laughed sometimes, and went to sleep each night believing they would wake up to another ordinary day. No one, not friends, not neighbors, not even the people inside the house, understood how fragile that normalcy really was, and how much pressure had already begun to build behind closed doors. At first, nothing changed all at once. There was no single argument, no explosive moment that made people step back and say, "This is where it started." Instead, the pressure built slowly, in small, ordinary ways that are easy to miss when you're living inside them. For CJ, one of the biggest changes came when his daily world expanded beyond the walls of the house. After years of homeschooling, he was enrolled in public high school. On paper, it made sense. It was a normal step, a chance to socialize, to grow, to prepare for adulthood. But for CJ, the transition was overwhelming. Crowded hallways, loud classrooms, constant noise, expectations that hadn't existed before. Where home had been structured and familiar, school felt chaotic and exposed. Teachers noticed that he was quiet, withdrawn, easily overwhelmed. He kept to himself. He didn't seem to connect. At home, CJ didn't have to explain himself. At school, he did. And every day, he had to walk back and forth between those two worlds. Around the same time, tensions inside the house began to surface more often. Arguments between CJ and his father became more frequent, not dramatic blow-ups, but persistent friction, school performance, responsibilities, expectations, even small things like how much time CJ spent alone or how he relaxed became points of conflict. From the outside, this still looked normal. Parents push, teenagers resist. Homes feel tense sometimes. That's not unusual. But inside CJ, something wasn't balancing. He struggled with anxiety, not the kind that announces itself loudly, but the kind that tightens quietly, the kind that makes everyday tasks feel heavier than they should, the kind that doesn't always come with words. Those closest to him could tell he was stressed, but stress doesn't always look dangerous. Sometimes it just looks like silence. In the weeks leading up to January, his mother began to worry. She noticed changes. Comments CJ made that felt darker than before. A sense that he wasn't just frustrated. He was overwhelmed, afraid, losing his footing. At one point, she confided in her oldest son that she believed CJ needed professional help. Therapy, someone outside the family, someone trained to listen. But that conversation didn't lead to action. Concerns about stigma, about reputation, about what it might mean for the family, all of it created hesitation, and hesitation turned into delay. Nothing was done immediately. Life continued. School days passed. Meals were eaten, doors opened and closed, and on the surface, everything still functioned. What makes cases like this so unsettling is not that the warning signs were obvious. It's that they were subtle. They blended into routines people trusted. They hid behind explanations that felt reasonable at the time. Stress, teenage moodiness, growing pains. No one believed they were standing at the edge of something irreversible. And by the time the pressure reached its breaking point, there was no room left for anyone to intervene. The morning of Friday, January 17, 2020, began quietly. CJ Haynie did not go to school that day. Instead, he remained inside the family home in Grantsville, while the rest of the household followed their normal routines. Sometime earlier that day, Haynie accessed firearms inside the house and placed ammunition in multiple locations, positioning it so it would be available when he needed it. Prosecutors would later describe this as deliberate preparation, not an impulsive act. From the outside, it was an ordinary Friday afternoon. Inside, however, Haynie was waiting. By early afternoon, the preparation was complete. Family members would begin returning home, unaware that the house they were walking into had already been turned into a controlled environment, one where Haynie had positioned himself, armed and waiting, with no interruption from the outside world. There was no alarm raised, no call for help, no indication to neighbors that anything was wrong. And as the first family members arrived home that afternoon, the plan moved from preparation to action. It was around 1 p.m. on that Friday afternoon when the mother, Alexia Haynie, returned home with her 12-year-old daughter, Milan, after a routine school pickup. It was a normal arrival, one that had happened countless times before. They entered the house believing they were alone with their son and brother. Both Alexia and Milan were shot when they entered the house. Both died from their injuries. Their deaths went undiscovered, and nothing about the exterior of the house suggested anything had happened. After that, the house went quiet. At around 2:00 p.m., 15-year-old Alexis arrived home from school. She entered the house the same way she always did, unaware of what had already taken place inside. She was shot multiple times and died inside the home. Once again, there was no outward sign of trouble. For the next several hours, the house remained still. During that time, 2 people came to the front door on separate occasions. One was a neighbor. The other was concerned when Alexis and Milan did not arrive for a scheduled piano lesson. Each time, the door was answered calmly. Reasonable explanations were given. Nothing appeared unusual. No one called police. No one raised concern. At approximately 5:17 p.m., 14-year-old Matthew arrived home from a birthday party. He entered expecting to find his family inside. According to investigators, he called out for them as he came in. He was shot almost immediately after entering the house. Matthew did not attempt to flee, and there was no indication that he anticipated danger. His death marked the 4th killing inside the home. Afterward, the silence returned. Nearly an hour passed by when the father, Colin Haynie Sr., arrived home, which was around 6:15 p.m. Colin immediately felt something was off when he got home. The house was quiet. The lights were lower than usual. No one answered when he called out. As he moved inside, he encountered his son, CJ, holding a gun. Almost immediately, CJ fired, striking his father in the leg. Despite the injury, Colin remained on his feet. A physical struggle followed. The confrontation was not brief. It continued for close to an hour inside the home. During that time, Colin repeatedly tried to take control of the weapon. CJ told him that the rest of the family was already dead, and that he intended to kill everyone in the house except himself. Colin continued to resist. The struggle moved through parts of the home as CJ struck his father with the gun. Colin lost blood but remained conscious, using what strength remained to prevent further shots from being fired. Outside, nothing appeared unusual. No one in the neighborhood realized what was happening. The confrontation ended only when a neighbor arrived unexpectedly to return a set of house keys. When the neighbor entered and saw the situation, the interruption created a brief moment of distraction. Colin used that moment. He was able to overpower his son and take control of the gun, bringing the violence inside the house to an end. The neighbor then drove both Colin and CJ toward the hospital. Emergency services Webob recontacted shortly afterward. Colin survived. He had been shot and beaten, but his resistance stopped the violence from continuing. By the time police were officially notified later that evening, the final confrontation was already over. What followed was no longer a fight for survival, but the beginning of an investigation that would reveal what had happened inside the house over the previous several hours. Earlier that evening, during the drive toward the hospital with the neighbor, CJ had already admitted that he had killed his family members. The statement was calm and unprompted, made before any formal questioning took place. It was documented and later preserved as evidence. By the time officers took him into custody, the immediate danger had passed. He was separated from his injured father and placed under police control as emergency responders focused on medical care and securing the scene. Officers from the Grantsville Police Department arrived at the Haynie home shortly after 7 p.m. They established a perimeter and began a systematic entry, moving through the house room by room. After his arrest, CJ declined to provide a formal statement. Questioning stopped in accordance with procedure. From that point forward, investigators relied on physical evidence, witness accounts, and the earlier admission made during the hospital drive. For officers on scene, the scale of the case became clear quickly. Grantsville had not seen a homicide in nearly 2 decades. Now, within a single household, 4 people were dead, making it one of the most significant criminal investigations the town had ever faced. What began as a contained family emergency had fully transitioned into a major criminal case, one that would soon draw state attention and require a detailed reconstruction of how the violence unfolded, hour by hour, inside the home. Once the home was secured, investigators began documenting the scene, room by room, in the order events appeared to have unfolded. The layout of the house immediately showed that this was not a single, contained incident. The victims were found in different areas of the home, not gathered in one location. That distribution mattered. It supported the developing timeline, indicating that the shootings occurred at separate times, as family members returned home over the course of the afternoon and evening. There were no signs of forced entry, no damage suggesting an intruder, nothing taken from the house. Everything pointed inward. Ballistics analysis confirmed that the same firearm had been used in all of the shootings. Shell casings recovered inside the home were consistent with that weapon. The locations of the victims and the condition of the scene aligned with the known timeline, reinforcing that the killings did not happen all at once. Investigators also documented evidence from the final confrontation between father and son. Blood patterns and disturbance inside the house showed movement that was clearly separate from the earlier shootings, helping establish when the violence ended. As physical evidence was processed, investigators turned to digital forensics. Electronic devices from inside the home, including phones and computers, were examined for messages, searches, or files that might explain what had happened or indicate prior planning. What stood out was what investigators did not find. They did not locate any written plans, manifestos, or messages outlining an intent to commit violence. There were no recorded threats and no digital material describing what would happen that day. The preparation had taken place without leaving a clear digital trail. Behavioral analysis focused on the time gaps between the shootings. Those gaps were central to understand. In the case, over several hours, CJ waited inside the house between arrivals. During that time, he answered the door, spoke with visitors, and gave ordinary explanations. Nothing in those interactions drew immediate attention or caused alarm. That ability to pause and continue without interruption became a key part of how investigators understood the sequence of events. Taken together, the scene layout, the ballistic evidence, the lack of forced entry, the absence of explicit digital planning, and the extended timeline, investigators concluded that the violence was not spontaneous. The evidence showed deliberate preparation and sustained intent carried out over time. In the end, it wasn't a single piece of evidence that defined the investigation. It was the pattern, and just as importantly, the lack of a digital trail, that revealed how controlled and methodical the events inside the house had been. With the physical evidence documented and the timeline established, attention turned to CJ's mental state, not to justify what happened, but to better understand it. Following his arrest, CJ underwent psychological evaluations as part of the legal process. These assessments examined his mental health, emotional development, and capacity to understand the consequences of his actions. The findings were presented in court as background context during later proceedings. Evaluators reported that CJ struggled with anxiety and emotional immaturity for his age. His defense emphasized that he was still an adolescent, pointing to incomplete brain development and limited coping skills when faced with stress or conflict. Prosecutors did not dispute that CJ had mental health challenges. Instead, they focused on how those challenges aligned with the evidence. They pointed to the extended timeline, the waiting between shootings, and CJ's ability to pause for hours at a time. They emphasized that he interacted calmly with people at the door and made decisions that required patience and awareness. From their perspective, those facts showed that he understood what he was doing and chose to continue. One explanation attributed to CJ became a central focus. According to court records, CJ stated that he believed if he killed only his father, the rest of the family would turn against him. In his reasoning, removing everyone else was the only way to prevent that outcome. It was not described as an attempt to end his own life, but as an effort to start over without his family. That explanation aligned with the methodical nature of the timeline and the choices made throughout the day. Even so, it did not fully explain the crime. There was no manifesto, no single triggering incident identified, no clear moment where everything suddenly changed. The court could determine responsibility, and the evidence could establish intent. But the deeper question, why this happened inside this family on this particular day, remained unresolved. That unanswered question became part of the case itself, not because the facts were missing, but because the explanation was incomplete. A reminder that even when every movement is documented and every device examined, some crimes leave gaps that evidence alone cannot fill. Formal charges were filed on January 26, 2020, 5 days after the killings. Because CJ was 16 years old at the time, Utah law required that the case be handled in adult court. Prosecutors charged him with 4 counts of aggravated murder for the deaths of his mother and 3 siblings, along with 1 count of attempted aggravated murder for shooting his father. Additional felony charges related to the discharge of a firearm were also filed. Bail was set at $4 million, $1 million for each life lost, effectively keeping CJ in custody as the case moved forward. Over the next 2 years, the case progressed through pretrial hearings, competency evaluations, and procedural motions, with CJ remaining in custody throughout. During that time, his father continued recovering from his injuries while coping with the loss of his family. On July 19, 2022, CJ entered a guilty plea to the major charges. The plea brought the trial phase to an end and moved the case directly toward sentencing. The sentencing hearing took place in July 2023. The judge reviewed the evidence, the established timeline, and statements submitted by both sides. Prosecutors emphasized the extended duration of the crime, the waiting between shootings, and the fact that the violence ended only when CJ was physically stopped. The defense again raised CJ's age at the time of the offense and his mental health history, asking the court to weigh those factors during sentencing. The sentence was handed down in clear terms. CJ received 4 consecutive sentences of 25 years to life for the murders. An additional 25 years to life for the attempted murder of his father was ordered to run concurrently. In practical terms, the sentence placed CJ in prison for decades, with parole eligibility far into the future. CJ made a brief statement to the court, saying he had learned from what he had done. His fiancé, Arthur, was present for sentencing, but chose not to speak. CJ's older brother Danny addressed the court remotely. He spoke about warning signs he believed had been visible before the killings and expressed his belief that the tragedy could have been prevented if help had been provided earlier. With sentencing complete, the legal process came to an end. The court had issued its judgment. What remained was the aftermath, for the surviving family, for the community of Grantsville, and for a case that would leave a lasting impact long after the courtroom emptied. In the months that followed, attention returned to Grantsville, a town still trying to understand what had happened inside one of its homes. For a community that had gone nearly 2 decades without a homicide, the scale of the crime was difficult to absorb. 4 members of one family had been killed, 1 survived, and the violence had come from within the household itself, not from an outside threat. Memorials appeared throughout the town. Yellow ribbons were tied to fences and trees. Flowers and handwritten notes were left in public places. A fundraising effort for surviving family members drew support from across Utah and beyond, including from people who had never met the family but felt compelled to respond. The house where the killings occurred remained empty for months. Eventually, it was sold to a family from outside the area. Even so, longtime residents continued to recognize it as a place that marked a shift, a reminder that something irreversible had happened there. The surviving family members stepped out of public view. Through legal representatives, Colin Haynie Sr. acknowledged the support he received, but made clear that his grief was ongoing and private. His recovery was not only physical, but emotional, carrying the loss of his wife and children while knowing the person responsible was his own son. CJ's older brother Danny spoke publicly only during court proceedings. His statements reflected a belief shared by many observers that earlier recognition and intervention might have changed the outcome. Beyond the family, the case left a lasting impression on the community. Conversations around adolescent mental health, family pressure, and early intervention became more open. While no single policy change could be traced directly to the case, it altered how people talked about warning signs and the cost of silence. Years later, the events of January 17th are not revisited often in Grantsville, but they are not forgotten. What happened in Grantsville wasn't the result of a single moment. It was a series of hours, decisions, and silences that ended in irreversible loss. Behind the headlines were a mother, children, and a family whose absence is still felt, even years later. Justice was delivered in court, but answers were not as complete. If there's anything this case leaves behind, it's a reminder to pay attention to the warning signs we hesitate to name and the conversations we put off having. If you have thoughtful insights or reflections on this case, share them respectfully in the comments. And if you want to watch more true crime documentaries like these in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel.